Are you prepared to enter a world where duty is a cage and desire is a deadly weapon? Step into the shadows of Blackwood Manor, a place of stormy skies and deep, unspoken secrets. This is the story of Isabella Harcourt, a beautiful, spirited heiress thrust into the care of the only man she must not love, Lord Nathaniel Ashford, her stern, brooding guardian. You won't be able to look away as their slow-burn restraint explodes into a devastating, all-consuming flame. The rules of society demand they remain apart, but the human heart has laws all its own. Will their forbidden love lead to ruin, or be the one thing that saves them both? Don't miss a single glance, a single confession, or a single act of defiance. Like and subscribe now. Part 1, Chapter 1, The Weight of Duty. The rain on the carriage roof was a steady, mournful drumbeat, a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to Isabella Harcourt's grief. She sat, small and still, wrapped in the oppressive black of her mourning weeds, watching the world blur outside the steamed-up window. Her parents, gone. A carriage accident on a cobbled road in Paris. The shock had frozen her tears, leaving her feeling hollowed out, a beautifully crafted locket with the precious portrait stolen from its case. She was 19 now, legally an adult by some measures, but a child still in the eyes of the law and, far more cruelly, in the eyes of society. She was an heiress, and therefore property to be managed. Her late father's will had been stark and final. She was placed under the guardianship of Lord Nathaniel Ashford, the Marquess of Blackwood, until a suitable marriage could be arranged. The carriage began to slow, the wheels crunching on a long gravel drive. The light outside was fading rapidly, the sky the color of bruised slate. Before her, rising from the gloom like a fortress built from a long-forgotten vow, stood Blackwood Manor. It was less a home and more a vast, gray presence, a monument to old wealth, and Isabella instinctively felt old sorrow. The footman opened the door, and the cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and ancient stone. As she stepped out, a figure detached itself from the manor's imposing doorway. Lord Nathaniel Ashford. He was taller than she had imagined, a figure cut from granite and shadows. Even in the gloom, she could see the severe line of his jaw and the depth of the dark coat he wore, a somber echo of her own clothes. He was in his late 30s, an age that seemed impossibly old and world-weary to her, a man whose face was defined by discipline and the absence of lightheartedness. Everything about him spoke of repression, from the rigorously tied cravat to the stern, unreadable expression in his eyes. He did not rush forward. He simply waited, standing motionless on the top step, watching her with an intensity that felt less like welcome and more like inspection. "Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone, a sound that seemed to absorb the surrounding noise. It was not unkind, but it was entirely devoid of warmth. "Welcome to Blackwood." "My lord," Isabella murmured, dipping into a curtsy that felt clumsy after the long journey. Her voice sounded thin and reedy in the face of his imposing gravity. He gestured for the servants to bring in her trunks, but his gaze remained fixed on her. "I trust the journey was not too arduous. You will find Blackwood quiet. I am your guardian now, Miss Harcourt. It is my duty to ensure your comfort, your education, and your propriety are maintained until your path in life is settled." Duty. The word fell between them like a heavy, cold coin. It was the only reason she was here, and the only reason he seemed to tolerate her presence. Their first interactions in the days that followed solidified this stern, distant arrangement. Nathaniel was punctilious to a fault. He had arranged for a governess, a stiff, silent woman named Mrs. Poole, to oversee her intellectual and social refinement, though Isabella was well past the age for such instruction. He had set out rules for meals, for walks, for receiving visitors, a rigid structure designed to keep every moment of her life predictable and, more importantly, chaperoned. He was rarely present, yet his presence was everywhere. She would catch glimpses of him, crossing the enormous silent gallery, bent over ledgers in his study, or riding out across the desolate moor with a grim expression that suggested he was riding toward a personal torment. Isabella quickly began to feel like a prisoner in his grand estate. The high ceilings, the endless dark wood, the portraits of dead, judging ancestors, they all seemed to watch her, waiting for a misstep. She missed the comfortable, bustling life she'd known. Now, everything was hushed and formal. One evening after dinner, She found the courage to speak to him in the library, where he sat behind a towering desk illuminated only by a brass lamp. "My lord," she began, standing near the great marble fireplace, I appreciate your effort, but I am 19. I do not require a governess to attend me on my daily walks. It makes me feel as if I am still in the nursery." Nathaniel slowly lowered the financial report he was reading, his gaze lifting to hers. The deep-set eyes were a dark, indeterminate color, shadowed and intense. "And what would you propose instead, Miss Harcourt?" he asked, his tone dangerously smooth. "That you wander the estate alone, or perhaps invite the villagers in for conversation?" "I propose that I be allowed the discretion of an adult woman," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but holding steady. Spirited, her father had called her. She would not let this stern man crush it. "My parents permitted me freedom." "Your parents are gone," he interrupted, the sharp finality of the statement drawing the blood from her face. "And they left you under my care. You are not merely a 19-year-old woman. You are a woman of immense consequence and fortune. Society watches you. I will not have your reputation, and by extension my own honor, tarnished by some youthful impulse for freedom. Mrs. Poole will attend you. That is my decree." He returned to his paper, a clear dismissal. Isabella's cheeks burned. She was utterly defeated. He was distant, yes, but he was also completely protective, cloaking her in a thick, stifling blanket of propriety that felt far more like a cage than a shield. Yet as the weeks progressed, a subtle, disquieting thing began to happen. Beneath his severity, Nathaniel watched her with a torment he could not name. He would catch her in the gardens, a splash of color and vitality against the monochrome landscape, and his eyes would linger a fraction too long on the way the wind lifted a strand of her chestnut hair, or the way she laughed with the gardener's boy over a fat, sluggish bumblebee. He saw the innocence, the naivete that made her so vulnerable, but he also saw the quick intelligence in her eyes and the curve of her throat, already hinting at a womanly form that was no longer a child's. One afternoon, she was attempting to reach a volume on a high shelf in the library, standing precariously on the arm of a chaise longue. The book, a heavy tome of poetry, was just out of reach. She stretched, losing her balance, and cried out as she began to fall. In an instant, he was there. He moved with a swiftness she would not have credited to such a grave man. His arms shot out, catching her around the waist, pulling her flush against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. The contact was shocking. Her hands instinctively flew up to steady herself against his stiff lapels. She could feel the steady, hard beat of his heart beneath the fine wool and the faint, masculine scent of starched linen and cold air. For a long, silent moment, they were utterly still, locked together. His grip was firm, almost bruising, and yet it felt impossibly safe. His head was bent close to hers, and she looked up into his face. His dark eyes were wide, momentarily stripped of their customary sternness, revealing a flicker of raw, almost desperate alarm. But beneath the alarm, another emotion flared, something hot, electric, and entirely inappropriate. He let go of her as if she were made of glass, and had suddenly grown too hot to hold. He stepped back, his face instantly reverting to a mask of glacial control. "Miss Harcourt," he rasped, his voice low and a little uneven. He cleared his throat. "You must exercise caution. Such carelessness is unacceptable. I will have the footman fetch all books for you in future." He retrieved the book she had wanted, a collection of Byron's scandalous verse, fittingly, and slammed it onto the desk. Isabella stood rooted, her body tingling from the brief, forbidden contact. The alarm in his eyes had not been merely for her safety, she realized. It had been for his own composure. She looked at his averted profile, stern, unforgiving, utterly consumed by a duty he was determined to fulfill. She knew then, with a sharp, unsettling clarity, that the wall between them was not built only of propriety and grief, but also of a torment in him that had nothing to do with finance or reputation. It was a dark, nameless thing that his stern demeanor was desperately trying to keep buried. As the dusk settled over Blackwood Manor, Isabella sat by her window, looking out at the endless, wind-swept grounds. She was supposed to be preparing herself to marry a suitable man, to find her place in the world. But all she could think of was the dangerous warmth of her guardian's hands around her waist, and the electric, unspoken moment when his duty had nearly been undone by something primal and forbidden. She was his ward, and he was her protector. In the silence of that isolated estate, the stage was set for a love that would defy every rule. Part 2, Chapter 2, A Dangerous Awareness. The oppressive quiet of Blackwood Manor was soon pierced by the insistent, demanding clamor of the outside world. Isabella had been in mourning for 3 months, a respectful seclusion that society, ever calculating, deemed long enough. The presence of a young, unattached heiress under the roof of a solitary, wealthy marquess was an equation that high society was eager to resolve. The season for whispers had begun, and those whispers soon solidified into action. The first hint came in the form of a summons to London. "You must be presented, Miss Harcourt," Nathaniel stated one chilly morning over breakfast, his eyes fixed on the financial section of the Times. "It is your duty to assume your proper place in society, and mine to ensure you are seen and properly courted." "Courted?" Isabella repeated, the word tasting strange and metallic on her tongue. "Married Miss Harcourt," he clarified, without looking up. "You are 19, wealthy and attractive. Your future lies in a suitable establishment. I will not have you sequestered here until you are considered a spinster." The cold finality of his plan chilled her far more than the thought of leaving the isolation of Blackwood. She was to be an item for auction, overseen by her stern broker, Lord Ashford. Their days in London began with a relentless succession of calls, balls, and soirees. Isabella's beauty and fortune were immediate drawing cards, and the suitors began to circulate like moths around a newly lit lamp. Among the crowd, one man quickly distinguished himself with his easy charm and practiced deference: Sir Reginald Cavanaugh. He was the very embodiment of society's acceptable path. Handsome in a pale, elegant way, with an immaculate wardrobe and a silvered tongue, Reginald was a man whose every move was designed to impress. He was attentive without being overbearing, complimentary without being crude, and crucially, he was deeply, visibly enamored of Isabella's inheritance. Nathaniel grew colder, pushing her toward Reginald and the others with an almost brutal determination. When Reginald's carriage called at their townhouse, Nathaniel would invariably be on hand not to observe the interaction, but to steer Isabella firmly into the drawing room and leave them alone, closing the door on her with a clipped instruction to be amiable. Isabella felt Nathaniel's distance like a physical ache. Every time he praised Reginald's suitability, his estate, his connections, his impeccable lineage, the words felt like shards of glass in her heart. He was performing his duty to perfection, playing the role of the disinterested, honorable guardian, but the forced enthusiasm in his voice felt hollow, strained. She would try to meet his eyes, searching for the flicker of humanity or warmth she had glimpsed at Blackwood, but he kept his gaze averted, focusing instead on the distance between them. Yet the jealousy gnawed at him, a silent, venomous thing that only his loyal steward, Mr. Davies, and perhaps Isabella herself, could sense. One evening, at a glittering assembly, Reginald held her hand a moment too long after a waltz. Nathaniel, who was speaking to a society hostess, the very woman who was always whispering of impropriety, stopped mid-sentence. His dark eyes shot across the crowded ballroom, and Isabella felt the sheer force of his attention, a sudden, powerful gravity that made her forget Reginald's touch entirely. There was a raw, possessive flare in his gaze, a look that spoke of something far beyond a guardian's concern for his ward's decorum. But just as quickly, the mask descended. He looked away, his expression hardening into stone, and he turned his attention back to the hostess with an unnaturally deliberate politeness. The next morning, he advised Isabella to accept Reginald's invitation for an afternoon carriage ride, stating, "The man is persistent, Belle. A decision must be reached soon." She was deeply drawn to her guardian's rare moments of gentleness, moments that were precious, precisely because they were so fiercely guarded. She began to notice the small things, the way he would leave a book she had mentioned casually on her bedside table, the way his voice softened marginally when he spoke of her parents, or the brief, almost imperceptible furrow of concern between his brows when she complained of a headache. These acts, so minute, so contrary to his usual stern demeanor, utterly confused her emotions. Was he a protector, a jailer, or something far more dangerous? The true climax of this dangerous awareness occurred during an impromptu dance lesson. Nathaniel insisted she needed to polish her ballroom skills, specifically the formal figures required for a complicated country dance, and dismissed her governess, claiming her presence was unnecessary for technical instruction. It was late afternoon in the large, unoccupied drawing room. The light was fading, casting long, dramatic shadows. A lone pianist played a sprightly air in the corner. Nathaniel stood opposite her, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. "You must keep your shoulders back, Miss Harcourt, and your footwork must be precise." He demonstrated the steps once, quickly, the unusual grace of his tall form making her realize she knew nothing of this man who moved so powerfully, yet was always so still. She tried to follow the complex pattern, but her mind was too full of him. As she attempted a turn, she caught the heel of her slipper on the rug. She gasped, flailing, and began to stumble. It was a repetition of that earlier pivotal moment at Blackwood, but this time the setting was far less safe. He moved again with that alarming swiftness. He didn't merely catch her, he swept her up. One powerful arm encircled her waist, anchoring her against the front of his body, while his other hand clamped down firmly on her shoulder to steady her. She was pressed against him, breathless, feeling the immediate dizzying heat of his body. The contact was not merely protective now, it was intimately, shatteringly real. "Careful, Belle," he breathed, the use of her shortened name a stunning violation of their established formality. His voice was a low, rough rumble right next to her ear, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. She looked up. His eyes, dark and deep, were directly above hers. The control that always ruled him was frayed, thin, almost non-existent. His pupils were dilated, and the air around them seemed to thicken, charged with a sudden, devastating tension. His hand that rested on her shoulder began to move, sliding down her back until it rested low on her spine. Then, the forbidden act, his hand lingering too long. It was a touch that ceased to be about balance and became entirely about possession. She felt the heavy, warm weight of his palm through the thin silk of her dress, and an answering heat sparked low in her abdomen. In that protracted, suspended moment, with the gentle music playing innocently in the background, Isabella saw not the stern guardian, but the man, a man consumed by a devastating, repressed desire. She didn't pull away. She leaned fractionally closer, her eyes locked with his, her lips parted slightly as she surrendered to the intoxicating terror of the moment. She felt her innocence wrestling violently with a sudden, overwhelming desire she could neither name nor understand. Then, the pianist hit a discordant note, and the spell shattered. Nathaniel jerked his hand away as if he had been burned. He put several feet between them immediately, turning his back to her to violently adjust his cravat, his chest heaving under his waistcoat. "That is sufficient for today, Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice flat and dangerously even. He did not look at her again. "We shall resume tomorrow. Ensure you are more mindful of your steps." He strode out of the room without another word, leaving Isabella alone with the silent pianist and the wreckage of her composure. She touched her waist where his hand had rested, her fingers tracing the path of the heat that still lingered there. She walked to the window, watching the street lamps ignite in the twilight. She was supposed to be preparing to be a wife to a man like Reginald, safe and predictable. But after that moment, all she could think of was the dangerous, forbidden heat of her guardian's touch, and the devastating realization that the only man her heart desired was the one man who was utterly, irrevocably off limits. Her awareness had awakened, and with it, the dreadful knowledge that the game they were playing was far more serious than she had ever imagined. Part 3, Chapter 3, The Fire Beneath Silence. The interlude in London had been an education. Isabella returned to Blackwood Manor carrying not the light-hearted anticipation of a young woman entering the world, but a heavy, complicated weight of awareness. She now knew two things with certainty: that the path society had laid out for her, embodied by the impeccably smooth Sir Reginald Cavanaugh, was unbearable, and that the only man capable of stirring her heart was locked behind a fortress of duty. The coldness that Nathaniel had used to push her away in London now seemed to have rebounded, locking him deeper within himself. He was more remote than ever, spending entire days cloistered in his immense library, leaving her to the stiff companionship of Mrs. Poole. It was this very solitude, however, that offered her a devastating insight. One rainy afternoon, driven by restlessness and an irrepressible desire to understand the man who guarded her, Isabella crept into the library while Nathaniel was out riding. She approached the desk, the epicenter of his life, and noticed a hidden, shallow drawer slightly ajar. A flash of ivory paper caught her eye. Her conscience screamed a warning, but her heart, now thoroughly invested in this forbidden drama, compelled her forward. She pulled the drawer open and found a small stack of tied letters, the ink faded, the handwriting elegant but unmistakably feminine. She sat in the enormous leather chair, the scent of pipe smoke and old paper enveloping her, and began to read. The letters spoke of a past Nathaniel had meticulously buried, a love affair, passionate and all-consuming, with a young woman named Evelyn. They were filled with youthful promises, poetry, and a happiness that made her current guardian's sternness a heartbreaking contrast. But the final letters were sharp with anguish. Evelyn, beautiful and impulsive, had been forced by her family to marry another, wealthier man, choosing security over love. The final missive was a suicide note, a frantic, despairing plea for forgiveness written hours before she drowned herself in the sea. Isabella carefully tied the ribbon and placed the letters back. The knowledge was a physical blow. Nathaniel wasn't merely a stern, brooding Marquess bound by the weight of duty. He was a man who had loved fiercely and lost devastatingly. His honor, his emotional repression, his deep-seated belief that desire made him unworthy, it was all rooted in the devastating conviction that his love brought ruin. He had failed to protect the woman he loved, and now he was utterly determined to guard his ward from a similar fate, even if it meant sacrificing his own heart. She began to see him not only as guardian, but as man. The iron facade now had a visible seam, and through it she glimpsed the vulnerability, the fire, and the tragedy that had forged him. Her love, previously a confused mix of yearning and frustration, now deepened into a powerful, compassionate devotion. This new depth of feeling gave her an unnerving resolve. She would not let him sacrifice her life to a safe, cold marriage, nor would she allow Reginald to claim her. The opportunity for conflict arrived swiftly. Reginald, emboldened by Nathaniel's apparent endorsement in London, arrived at Blackwood unannounced, determined to press his suit. Nathaniel was detained by a matter with his steward, leaving Isabella and Reginald alone in the main salon. Reginald's charm, which had once seemed polished, now struck her as predatory. He spoke of their future, of merging their estates, and then, without warning, he crossed the few feet separating them. "You know you are destined for me, Belle," he murmured, grasping her hand too tightly. He raised it to his lips, but instead of a chaste kiss, his mouth lingered on her skin, and his grip tightened on her wrist. "Lord Ashford is an old man and a guardian, a temporary fixture, but I am your future." He attempted to pull her closer. Isabella, shocked by his sudden boldness, yanked her hand away, retreating. "Sir Reginald, I must insist." "Nonsense," he scoffed, advancing again, a cold, confident gleam in his eye. "You are a woman, and you have feelings. Don't deny the attraction. Give me a kiss now, Belle, and let us dispense with the formality." Just as he reached for her, the drawing-room door flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. Nathaniel stood framed in the doorway, a figure of pure, terrifying wrath. He did not speak. He simply filled the space with a palpable aura of savage fury. His hands were clenched into fists, and the lines of sternness on his face were carved deeper by an emotion far more elemental than mere duty. Reginald, startled, immediately released Isabella, his composure evaporating. "Ashford, my dear fellow, merely a bit of light flirtation with Miss Harcourt. Get out." Nathaniel's voice was low, vibrating with suppressed violence. The words cut the air like a lash. "Get out of my house, Cavanaugh. If you ever presume to lay a hand upon my ward or set foot upon my property again, I will forget your title and call you out." Reginald blanched, realizing the depth of the Marquess's rage. This was not the anger of a conscientious guardian. It was the ferocious, unthinking protection of a man whose possessions had been threatened. He stammered an apology and fled the room like a whipped dog. Isabella stood trembling, not from fear of Reginald, but from the terrifying intensity of Nathaniel's defense. Nathaniel closed the door and turned to her. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and he did not attempt to soften his expression. He looked at her, his dark eyes ablaze. "Are you harmed?" he demanded, stepping closer. "No, my lord," she whispered, her throat tight. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek as if checking for a bruise. He stopped himself inches from her skin, his eyes dropping. His jaw worked silently. "You will not encourage such men," he said, his voice raw. "You will not invite liberties." "I did not encourage him," she retorted, suddenly indignant at the unfairness of his accusation. "He presumed, and you stood there, telling me he was suitable, pushing me toward him." He flinched at her words, a muscle twitching under his eye. The fury was gone, replaced by a profound, desolate self-loathing. "I am trying to ensure your future, Belle," he said, the use of her name again, this time an admission of his own internal chaos. "A life with him, safe and correct, is better than the life you will have if you tempt ruin." His fury had betrayed more than duty. It had revealed a primitive, possessive fear of losing her, a terror rooted in the memory of losing Evelyn. That night, after the manor had descended into silence, Isabella was walking back to her room carrying a single flickering candle. She was halfway down the long, shadowed gallery when she saw a light at the end. Nathaniel was there, standing by a mullioned window, equally illuminated by a lone candle he held. He was dressed informally in a dark robe, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked tired, haunted, and utterly human. They stopped at a distance, separated by the immense expanse of the cold stone floor, the only illumination their two wavering candles. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. They did not speak. They did not move. Their eyes met by candlelight in the hall. It was a long, naked exchange. Isabella's gaze offered compassion, recognition, and the absolute declaration of a love she could no longer deny. Nathaniel's eyes, dark and fathomless, were a tortured confession, a desperate struggle between the honor that demanded he retreat and the forbidden longing that demanded he cross the space between them and claim her. The heat of the two candles seemed to merge across the intervening distance, filling the air with a devastating current. The silence between them was unbearably charged. It was the moment of complete mutual admission. After an eternity, Nathaniel, defeated by his own sense of honor, lowered his gaze first. He extinguished his candle with a swift final pinch of his fingers, plunging his corner of the hall back into darkness. Isabella stood for a moment longer in the solitary pool of her candlelight, feeling the profound, beautiful pain of their shared secret. The fire beneath his silence had flared, and now it had ignited a responding flame in her. The rules were still in place, but their hearts had already broken them. The air between Isabella and Nathaniel is now irreparably charged. Isabella has seen the man beneath the marquess, the profound tragedy that fuels his duty. Nathaniel's fury against the predatory Sir Reginald has violently betrayed the depth of his forbidden possession. Their unspoken desires met and ignited in the candlelight, marking a point of no return. This concludes part one of My Guardian's Forbidden Love. Nathaniel has chosen duty, pushing Isabella towards the safe harbor of an appropriate marriage. But the heart is defiant. What happens when fate traps them alone, forcing their masks to slip completely? In part two, the walls will crumble. You won't want to miss the storm that locks them in, the heartbreaking near confession, and the tragic choice that sets the stage for ultimate ruin. Hit that notification bell to be the first to know when part two arrives.